Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Half Pint session. So today we have a returning guest, and it's sort of piggybacking on the recent episode that we had with Dr. Joshua Harris about C.S. Lewis and gender. We recorded that episode just before Meryl Streep Gate or Aslan Gate, whatever you want to call it. But the rumor that was put out that Aslan was going to be voiced by a woman. And that seemed like a good idea to jump on that topic and to continue the discussion about C.S. Lewis's views on gender. And this time we're doing it with returning guest Annie Crawford. Annie, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, David. It's great to see you again.
Now, the last time we spoke, you were doing a course with Symbolic World. How did that go? What else have you been working on since?
Yeah. Yes, I did a class for Symbolic World on Till We Have Faces, and it was fantastic. We had a great time. Although January feels like years ago at this point. But the Symbolic World people, C.S. Lewis people should check out the Symbolic World people. There's a lot of overlap. The people over there are committed to recovering a sacramental, symbolic understanding of the world. They have such depth of insight into stories and how symbols work, so that it's just a pure joy to get to lead that group of people through a book, a rich, meaningful book like Till We Have Faces. We had a great time. And now I am working on a few projects. One, trying to survive the end of term, as all teachers are. While, kickstarting a few Lewis projects. I've been speaking and writing on that hideous strength and kind of the symbolic duality that we see in the judgment of Belbury at the end. So that's a fun topic. And then working on a few essays about, continuing to dig into Lewis's views of gender in Till We Have Faces. So quite a few irons in the fire, trying to hang on to them all.
And what made me think of you for this episode was I was going through the Symbolic World back catalogue, and I came across the discussion you had with Jonathan Peugeot about gender and particularly C.S. Lewis's view of it. So I would encourage everybody to go and have a listen to the episode I did with Dr. Joshua Herring. But would you mind giving us your own take on Lewis's understanding of gender?
Yes, well, that's a big question. Yes, I think it's really helpful to ground this discussion in Lewis's metaphysic, his view of reality, because how we perceive the structure of reality is going to affect the way we perceive the things in that reality, such as gender and men and women. And so I find it helpful to start with Lewis's sacramental understanding of reality. He was a Christian Platonist. And so the way that he perceived reality working is that there is, the origin of being is God, who is spirit. And he, symbolically represented through all the ancient myths, and in Genesis as heaven. And God, who is spirit, he creates this physical world, and he's created it to be a manifestation, an embodiment of truths, of spiritual truths. The psalmist tells us, Lewis's favorite psalm, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, that God created this world to tell us about himself. So we call it a sacramental worldview because a sacrament is a visible material sign of an invisible spiritual reality. And we have our special sacraments such as Eucharist and baptism. But those can be special sacraments because it's in the context of a meaningful sacramental world. So this is the structure of reality that Lewis is coming to the topic of gender with, right? And I have a few, Lewis doesn't talk about a sacramental worldview explicitly in many places. I think once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's implicit everywhere. Yeah. But there are a few letters where he talks about it explicitly. In a letter from April 18th, 1940, he says, quote, "There is an eternal world of which our world is a manifestation." So there you get that heaven being the invisible being made visible through the material world in which we live in. And then interestingly, he connects in another letter from April 28th, 1955. He connects a sacramental worldview specifically to issues of gender and everyone's favorite topic, contraception. God bless Michael Ward for being willing to talk about that one. So in that
Excellent
letter,
episode on the Optimistic Curmudgeon podcast. Everyone should watch that as well.
it was a great episode. Michael Ward is always so gracious and articulate. He's really a model for all of us on how to speak about these things. So in that April 28th letter, Lewis says he realizes that with the advent of contraception, quote, there is no argument against promiscuity. You can't argue against promiscuity on a kind of, well, you'll get practical grounds, you'll get pregnant grounds. So we're going to have to return to the whole supernatural symbolic view of man in order to sustain the traditional Christian understanding. Okay, so in this sacramental worldview where we have heaven and earth, how do we understand gender? And I know with Dr. Herring, with Josh, you started your episode with that very key provocative quote where Lewis calls gender, quote, a reality more fundamental than sex. Sex is in fact merely an adaptation of organic life. So we can think of a material expression of, at the level of biological life, a fundamental polarity which divides all things. Okay, well, what is that fundamental polarity? It's heaven and earth. It's creator and creation. That is the fundamental polarity that defines gender. Okay, why? Let's look at the word gender. The Greek root gen means birth, or that which produces, or that which creates, right? And it's the root for Genesis, how the world's created. It's the word for generate and genital, those organs by which we create new life, right? So heaven and earth, those are the fundamental polarity is gendered because it's the marriage of heaven and earth that creates the world, right? So bring in Lewis's Christian Platonism, spirit, form, intentionality, design, purpose, meaning gets expressed in body and matter, and that's what things are. And so this fundamental polarity is in all things, because to be a thing is to be the wedding of the marriage of form and matter, heaven and earth. So that is, kind of the metaphysical structure of how Lewis understands gender. So let me pause there and see where you might want to go next.
Well, it just strikes me that, the hinge that we hear about in Perelandra, that thing that changed everything, is the incarnation. But in many ways, that's the apex. That's the culmination of what has always been essentially an incarnational process of something that has been spiritual and supernatural becoming incarnate in the world. All of that Christian Platonism sort of coming into play.
Yes, and that's why you'll have, the church fathers talk about Christ being slain before the foundation of the world. This idea that the incarnation, in some sense, happens outside of time. That rather than it being a change in plan, somehow the incarnation, as you say, is the culmination, the climax of this incarnational creation to begin with.
Okay, so we have these essential polarities, heaven and earth. How does that then start to relate to gender as Lewis starts writing his works like Perelandra?
Right. So the masculine symbolically represents heaven. So Lewis connects the masculine to spirit, to meaning, to form. In Perelandra, let me pull up that famous passage where he sees the masculine. Yeah, it's the end where you have the two, Mars and Venus, Malacandra and Perelandra, manifesting themselves. And he imagines them as without sexual characteristics so that he can try to tap into the spiritual principality, the archetype of what masculine and feminine are. And he says that Malacandra, or Mars, has this outward look, the look of a sailor, that which is going to give itself outwardly, right? Where Perelandra, the feminine, has the inward, receptive, receiving and giving of embodiment look. And so for Lewis, the masculine is the sacramental manifestation, manifestation of heaven, and the feminine is that manifestation of the receptivity of creation and matter. And, I think it's helpful to understand this structure as fractal, that it repeats on levels, right? And so you have Lewis, I can't remember where he talks about this, but I could pull up the receipts at some point. That each of us, in relation to God, right? He says that what is above us is so masculine that we are all feminine in relation to it. I think it's Ransom that tells Jane that. And so at the level of being human, we are feminine, receptive of being in relation to God. But in being human, we are masculine in relationship to earth, that we are invited to participate as co-creators with God, giving form, cultivating purposeful, meaningful form in the world. That's our cultural mandate. And so as humans, we have in us, as Jung says, both the masculine and the feminine, because we stand between heaven and earth as a point of integration. But then in relation to one another as sexual beings on the biological, familial level, that polarity, that fundamental polarity sort of divides into persons, and we have men and we have women. And it is together that we image in marriage that heavenly image. And I think I find it very helpful, in these conversations about gender, which can be tricky, to realize that I have in me both the masculine and the feminine, which I am to integrate in my unique life. But on the level of my body, as a woman, I am to manifest femininity in relationship to my husband and at that biological sexual level. But that doesn't reduce me to merely the feminine. I still participate, every person a microcosm. I still participate in the whole of that picture as a person. As Dorothy Sayers says, women are human still,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. And the idea of there being some level of combination, you actually even find it in that important Perelandrian text, because when we hear about Malacandra, about his eyes that are impregnated with distance, which is, that you suddenly have a very, very feminine loaded word used to describe Malacandra.
Isn't that so neat? I was thinking about that today, because it is the union of form and matter that makes a thing. And so even Malacandra's eyes, the masculine, say, form or principle impregnated in his eyes is what gives them their being, right? So that fundamental polarity present right there in the description of Malacandra's eyes. I hadn't noticed that until yesterday, actually, David. So glad you bring it up.
Excellent. Yeah, I read that the final few chapters so many times, just trying to wrap my head around what am I even reading here? Because there seems to be this. It's very Venusian in terms of the text is just so rich and so pregnant with so many images. It's just trying to peel them all back and paying attention to Lewis's word choice. I'm actually reading my son, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for the first time at the moment. And I'm doing this in Holy Week. And so we are going to finish actually on Easter Sunday with Aslan's Resurrection. I'm really pleased that worked out well.
How fantastic.
But as I'm reading through it slowly with him, it's a consistent thing with Lewis. I've said it before, but reading it slowly with my son has made it even clearer. Lewis's word choice, every single word, he is choosing it very purposefully because he wants to spark things off in your mind and draw connections, even if he's not drawing them explicitly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, which is because he had such a deeply, richly incarnational view, sacramental view, realizing that things mean things. Everything bears with it meaning. And so he's always so intentional and drawing meaning together. He called himself a dinosaur in De Descriptione Temporum, and that really, in a way, he was so enamored with that medieval view. It so saturated his imagination. And what were the medievals? They were synthesizers. They were always perceiving the macrocosm in the microcosm. And I feel like that also so much characterizes Lewis's work, which is why just to bring up a little bit of maybe controversy, I just can't imagine that he changed his mind about all this at the end of his life. Mm-hmm. It was the way he saw everything. And I think that as I interpret his later years and his relationship with Joy, that was bringing richness and nuance, but not a fundamental restructuring.
Yeah,
Of this
more
cosmic
data, data to play. It's one of the lines in Narnia when he talks about. I think it was in The Horse and His Boy when the girls go off to talk about dresses and things, and there's a few other instances in the Chronicles where he says, and they talked about things that girls of that age like to talk about. He's like, I don't know. I'm a dude. I hang out with dudes the entire day. Yeah. I'm sure whatever they did. But when Joy charged into his life and started crashing down, knocking down all of his walls, suddenly he dealt with an awful lot more feminine than I think he was typically used to.
Right. And I feel like he, for the most part, treated those moments with a humility of I'm not sure, I'm not going to try and write about it, and not in any way a condescending or a dismissive, but just an appropriate humility, because a writer always writes best when they write what they know about.
Yeah. And he was well aware of what he didn't know. Just one more thing I wanted to mention before we move on to the next thing that I wanted to talk about. You mentioned that humanity, in essence, in relation to God, is feminine because it's about receptivity. And for me, that's best expressed in the medieval scholastics, but also the mystics in particular, when they would always speak about their relationship with God, of that of a maiden to a suitor. Mm-hmm. And you see that very clear fundamental orientation towards God, that God is the one who is pursuing. I mean, it's even in scripture, that, he loved us first. While we were still sinners, Christ came to save us. He was the one that does the initiation, and we're the ones that receive that.
And you also see that in the medieval elevation of Mary as the archetypal Christian example of her receptivity and her humility. She's elevated as the human, the fully human, right? Christ is the God-man worthy of our admiration, but Mary is the archetype of the purely human in her receptivity of God.
Who says, let it be done unto me according to your word. Do whatever he tells you. It's that position of receptivity. Which is what
Ransom learns in Perelandra. It's really his Marian journey, which then has this fun twist where he has to obey, to be fully receptive to the will of God, means he has to perform a very masculine task. But you see that duality in relation to God. He is learning to walk in Marian receptivity, but then in relation to the earth, that receptivity leads him to perform this, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, smash the rock.
Well, I think we've really established Lewis's conception of gender and how he's sort of building up to it. And so when we were talking about this before, and he said, "What did you want to talk about?" I wanted just to have a little point where we talk about Lewis's conception of gender: the good, the bad, and the weird. Basically, what does this give us? What is his work? In what ways is it a gift to humanity, and in particular, obviously, the church at the moment? Which bits are you less sure about, and which bits are just out there? Because there are some bits that are. I've got to say, I still sort of read that and I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, Jack, but I'm sure it's profound.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. Let's talk about the weird. And, I will say the good for me personally has been no other author has helped me like being a woman more than C.S. Lewis, honestly. I mean, you read Perelandra, it's a glorious hymn to the beauty of womanhood, of the feminine. And as a modern woman, who grew up liberal, this is something I had to learn. And so that's what I think for me personally is really good about Lewis's vision, is that he helped me to understand how femininity is not something to run away from, but something to receive as beautiful gift. Okay, but then let's go weird. And so two particular weird spots that I think about is one in that hideous strength. Mm-hmm. Let me see if I can find this. And this is after, I think it's near the end. Maybe you remember a little bit more, but in that hideous...
I think I've got the line you're talking about. It Venus and Malacandra represented those two of the 7 genders which bear a certain analogy to the biological sexes and can therefore be in some measure understood by men.
Yes. Okay. So this threatens to undo everything I just said. Right? Because if you have heaven and earth, this is a fundamental polarity. I mean, polarity by definition has to do with poles, which are opposite. Lewis knows that the meaning of words comes through their metaphorical basis. So we have poles. That's a fundamentally dual word. So what is Lewis doing? And my basic take on this passage here is that he made a mistake. I don't think that Lewis would appreciate the kind of intellectual engagement or scholarship that feels the need to agree with him on everything or think that he is perfect. Or, the Inklings had way too much of a robust, swordplay type of relationship to think. I just think that Lewis would not like all of his scholars coming along and trying to figure out how to agree with him about everything. We think he's always right. So I think it's good to practice discernment and disagreement, that he wasn't a saint. He wasn't perfect. There's probably going to be places where he was a little wrong. And I think that's my read on this, because otherwise I don't really know how to put it together. Where you say fundamental polarity over here and you talk about heaven and earth and the myth become fact. Is that where it is? No, it's in the Four Loves, where he talks about the Sky Father and the Earth Mother
and the crowns.
What's with the 7 genders? What he should have just said is you just pull out the word gender and you put in archetype or intelligences, which is what the word oyarsa is pulling from a medieval Latin word that he found in an interesting text that really means the genus or the intelligence of a planet. If he just used that word instead, we'd have no problem. And so I kind of wonder if he just accidentally slipped into an equivocation. Now, maybe he was. So then we need to go to the second weird to test that interpretation.
Okay. Right.
So our second weird spot is in a recorded conversation that he had called Unreal Estates. And I believe this was recorded in, oh goodness, I think I wrote down the wrong date. Because this was when he was at Cambridge, and I think on the verge of being too ill to teach. Do you remember the date for Unreal Estates?
I do think it's late, but...
And maybe look it up. So it's in this... He was having a conversation with other science fiction writers, Kingsley Amis
and Brian Aldiss.
Aldiss, yes. Mm-hmm. And it was recorded. And so that's really unique. We don't have... Most of what we have that Lewis wrote, or to read of Lewis, is stuff he crafted as an author, right? And so this is a unique little piece where we have him candid in conversation. Now, I'm sure he knew it was being recorded, but we all experience that I'm going to be talking and bantering with you in a way that's a little bit different than I was sitting, with my pen and paper and writing it out. So this is a recorded conversation, and they're talking about science fiction and the future of the genre, the challenges of the genre, and talking a little bit about how difficult it is to imagine the truly alien or novel or different, to come up with new ideas in the realm of sci-fi. And so where does it come up? Let me find it real quick for you. I have it right here.
And while you're looking, it was December 1962.
Thank you. I thought it was that late. Yeah, very late. Which, given his health, I'm still like, you're still drinking whiskey? Because in it, he's like, well, let's pour another glass of whiskey. And I'm like, oh, Lewis.
You're living in an atomic age, learning in wartime. It's like, let's just keep going.
Right, but a little bit, like, as a Lewis person, you're like, you could have lived longer and given me some more stuff to read, But anyway, God bless him. That's right. The end will find him doing the human things, talking literature and sharing a wee dram with his friends. So he says, by the way, has any science fiction writer yet succeeded in inventing a third sex, apart from the third sex we all know? Clifford invented so one of the people replies, well, this one guy invented a setup where there were 7 sexes. Lewis says, how rare happy marriages must have been then. And rather worth striving for, perhaps, Aldiss replies. And then Lewis replies, Obviously, when achieved, they'd be wonderful. Laughter. Ha ha ha. Okay, so that's weird. But in the context of playful banter, so here's kind of my interpretation. And again, this is the weird. So, there's room for debate, and it would make interesting debate here. But I think he's curious to see if anyone has managed to make something beyond the polarity work. Lewis had an explorative imagination. Has anybody pulled this off? Open to, something beyond what he's been able to understand or imagine before. And then the rest of the conversation, the kind of joking banter, I would engage in, even though I don't think there's something more than two genders personally. So that's kind of my interpretation, is that Lewis, even Homer nods, and he used the word gender when he really probably, to be consistent with himself, should have used the word intelligence or genus. And that in this is kind of a curious conversational banter. But I don't, this is the other weird part, right? Because he said, apart from the third sex, we all know. Well, this is such an interesting phrase because, we all know. And I'm like, no, we don't. I don't know what you're talking about. So thanks. The best thing I can come up with is, does he mean eunuchs? Do we just mean that the third gender we all know kind of historically is the eunuch, the neuter, the neutered person, which technically is not a gender.
Yeah.
Because there is no way that it generates life, right? So if that's what gender is, it is the thing that participates in the generation of new life. And so neuter isn't really a gender. What it really is a breakdown of gender. A eunuch is someone who was a man, but his generative capacity has been broken in some way. And so we create a third category that I think, when properly understood, is a dysteleological or non-functional category rather than a true other gender. So tell me what you think about that. Play devil's advocate.
I have lots of thoughts, and they're all kind of confused. But we'll start with the third sex. There is precedent in Christian history for describing eunuchs, be they physical or spiritual, as a third gender. I agree with you. I don't think it's the best word for it, but you sort of see how it comes about, particularly when you have, when you have lots of scholastics writing in Latin, where you have masculine, feminine, and neuter as being options. So that was the first thing. I think that is what he is talking about, and I would say the dysteleological. Try and say that easily. The dysteleological is one way of looking at it, but it also seeing it as something of transcendence, particularly when you couch it against a medieval worldview of understanding celibacy, of its preparation for it's living the life of the angels now. So it itself is pointing upwards. And possibly pointing to the future state in heaven, when Christ says in heaven they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. So that is a possibility. One other thing, while we're still in that essay, that discussion, Unreal Estates, it's interesting that they both use the word invent. Lewis asked if someone's invented a third sex. Now, if you're inventing something, that means that it's maybe not in existence already. There is something almost synthetic about it. And in Amos's response, when he said, so-and-so set up invented a setup where there were 7 sexes. Well, that's actually sort of what Lewis himself does in the other work you mentioned, That Hideous Strength. He has invented a setup where he describes there being 7 genders and linking it with this conception of the planets. And my only other thought in relation to that, when I first read That Hideous Strength and I saw that reference to seven genders, it actually put me in mind of the Book of Revelation. I remember the very first time I read it, it's with a Baptist friend of mine, and I came across the line where it spoke about the 7 spirits of God. I was like, wait, what? How does this fit into the Trinity? But as I continued through the book, seeing 7 as a symbolism for completeness and wholeness, and spoiler warning for the end of That Hideous Strength, we haven't done it on the show yet, so skip ahead if you don't know what happens, where you have the planets invading. It's the entirety of the cosmos coming to St. Anne's. And so there's a sense of completeness. And so how I started to go with that passage of in that hideous strength is something that Lewis is saying something to the effect of, we have these two genders that we see here on Earth in the masculine and the feminine. We see it manifested, but it is part of something even greater. This itself is only a small glimpse into the totality of what we see. And taking that and then maybe connecting it with the book of Genesis, where it speaks about God making in his image and likeness, and it's male and female together, that it sort of becomes greater than the sum of its parts. Mm-hmm. Like I said, my thoughts were slightly confused, lots of random little things picking up, but those are the things that tend to kick around my head whenever I read those sections.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I feel like ultimately we're just dealing with an equivocation that if we just clarify terms, resolves tensions. However, again, I could be wrong, but if there is a fundamental polarity or a fundamental duality, God is God and we are not. And that is a binary polarity in the fabric of being that can't be otherwise. Right? And so if we're going to set up gender as the sacramental symbolic expression of that fundamental polarity, we're going astray to try and use the word gender for other archetypal intelligences, principalities, dynamics. And so my best read is, what I like to think, and again, I could be wrong, but that Lewis so loved the medieval cosmos, as Michael Ward has shown us all at length, right? And he loved the idea of the 7 planets. And 7 is the most magical, powerful number. It is the number of perfection, which, as an aside for your listeners, if you don't quite understand why 7 is the number of perfection, I think one way to understand is that 4 is the number of Earth, right? Because you got your 4 directions, northwest, east, and south. And then 3 is the number of heaven because it's the number of the circle. And that together, heaven and earth, 3 and 4 make 7. Okay, so it's one way to understand the symbolism of 7. And you see that in the structure of a church because you have the square altar with the dome of heaven above. And so your church is structurally heaven and earth, 3 and 4 come together in the marriage of Christ and his bride at the Eucharist every Sunday. So think about that this Easter when you go to celebrate at the Lord's table.
And subscribe to Jonathan Pageau's new class because he covers lots of this sort of stuff in there.
That's right, for sure. Exactly. And so I think he was so enamored with the 7 planets and always looking for a way to get the 7 planets in. We got the 7 planets coming down. And he's an imaginative, speculative person, right? And so I just kind of think his imagination ran a slip away from him. And that if he were here talking with us, he'd be like, oh, yes, Annie, you're quite right. I should have said intelligences, and now all is well. But,
I think it's like scripture. You interpret the vaguer, more complicated ones in terms of the ones that are clearer.
Right, exactly. Now, to what you're saying about the spiritual eunuch, this is an idea I get from Pageau, and it's in that conversation you reference if people want to go listen. And
there will be a link in the notes.
But we have this idea of we can transcend something either above or below. So if we think of our reality as hierarchically fractal, and I said, one way to see these levels is I as a person, and then me in my marriage. So as a person, I integrate heaven and earth, the masculine and feminine within. But on the level of my marriage, I participate as the one who embodies the feminine, and he embodies the masculine. And so we have these levels to reality. And so what the saint does, and this is how the Catholic Church will talk about celibacy, is that the monk or the nun will forsake the marriage of heaven and earth at the level of the biological or the sexual. They will opt out of physical marriage in order to move up a level and participate in the divine marriage, in the marriage in a direct way, a unique way between the marriage between Christ and his church. And so in a sense, a man will be a eunuch for Christ by transcending his biological sexuality in order to participate in that heavenly marriage. And I think we see Ransom do this, actually, in that hideous strength. He goes to Mars and he is kind of sanctified in his masculine aspect. As we talked about, he goes to Paralandra and he's sanctified in his Marian journey in his feminine aspect. And then when we see him on that hideous strength, he is in some sense a eunuch for Christ. He is living a celibate life. He is the link between heaven and earth, participating in the heavenly marriage. And I think it's a scholar named Benjamin Sjogren who sees that by having him called both Pendragon and Fisher King, those two titles in the person of Ransom bring together the masculine and the feminine, because the Pendragon is a kingly masculine title, but the Fisher King is a passive bleeding figure. There's a lot of feminine imagery to the Fisher King. I think Charles Williams talks about this as well. And so Ransom, showing that way of transcending gender as a spiritual eunuch by integrating the masculine and feminine in his participation of the heavenly marriage. But we can also, so that's one way that we move between the levels, but we can also move, we can not transcend, but we can fall apart. So our expression as male and female can fall apart. And that's what I would say would be a dysteleological eunuch. So the man who has, been turned into a physical eunuch has not transcended spiritually into a greater participation, but he's been wounded or violated and pushed down into a dysteleological disintegration. So there's a difference between transcending our biological gender and it disintegrating. And I think that's really important also just to note, Ransom in his being let's say a spiritual eunuch or transcending his gender, he still presents as a man at the physical level, so much so that Jane is in danger of falling in love with him, right? So that transcendence into the heavenly marriage does not degrade the way that we manifest and present gender at this level. As Lewis says, the higher doesn't stand without the lower. So our holy, the transcendence is rooted in clarity of levels, not confusion of levels. And I think in our culture that gets confused about these things, that's important to clarify.
Wonderful. Well, we're running a little long, but I did still want to talk about Aslan Gate. Now, I am personally of the opinion that this is all just a big PR stunt. It is just to get a lot of people hot and bothered, make YouTube videos. Congratulations, you did it, and to get people to respond to this, because I don't think that the business people are quite that crazy. We'll see if I'm proved wrong, but the Christian community really helped support the last Narnia movies, and I think it would have been a very foolish choice to make them all angry. So, with that said, why have people got angry at the suggestion that we might have to change the phrase to "she is not a tame lion"?
Yeah, and I think you're right that it's a PR stunt. It might also be a testing the waters, right? How
attached are you to this?
Yeah, let's say Gerwig is personally interested in pushing the envelope, as I think we can see from some of her previous movies a little bit. And so, generate conversation and test and see where the boundaries of success might be before making any actual decisions is kind of how I read it.
For what it's worth, I think Meryl Streep is involved, and I think she's much more likely to be either Diggory's mother or Aunt Letty.
Yes. She'd be a great actress for a role in a movie. But why is it upsetting? And I think, once you understand that sacramental structure and the way that masculine and feminine for Lewis, and I think the Christian tradition represents heaven and earth in Aslan, Lewis says Narnia is a supposal, not direct allegory, although that's a whole other topic. But it's a supposal where, let's suppose, what would happen if Christ, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of the Father, was incarnate in a world that had rational animals? Suppose that happened. What might that look like? And so what that means is that Aslan is, an incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, who in the Christian tradition, Scripture teaches us to call a son, that we are given masculine symbolism for our way of understanding God, which Lewis reiterates, in relation to God, who is so masculine, we are all feminine. And so seeing God and the second person of that Trinity as in masculine terms is really essential to the structure of the Christian religion, to the structure of heaven and earth. And so to flip the gender is to symbolically flip the whole Christian world upside down. And Lewis makes this clear in his essay, Priestesses in the Church. Let me see if I think I have that quote for you. He says, suppose, so he's talking about the conditioners. If you've read The Abolition of Man, you know that Lewis kind of uses this word, the conditioners, as the people who are trying to change reality. In Abolition of Man, he talks about, look, the wise men of old says it's our job to conform our will to the structure of reality. The new men, the modern men, the conditioners seek to change reality to the nature of our will. Okay, so this is who Lewis has in mind here. Suppose the conditioner says that we might just as well pray to our mother, which art in heaven, as to our Father. Suppose the conditioner suggests that the incarnation might just as well have taken a female as a male form, and the second person of the Trinity might as well be called a daughter as a son. Suppose, finally, the mystical marriage were reversed, that the church were the bridegroom and Christ were the bride. It is surely the case that if all these supposals were ever carried into effect, we should be embarked on a different religion. Goddesses have, of course, been worshipped. Many religions have had priestesses, but they are religions of quite different character than Christianity. So this is why the idea of a feminine Aslan does and rightly should upset Christians. We don't have to get all angry and act poorly, but we should rightly be offended, or in the sense of we should protest. That's not right, and we should say it's not right, because to invert the order of the world is to, as Lewis says, step into a different religion altogether.
I love it. I'm not gonna push too hard on that, because I think that's really all that needs to be said. Because everything that we said was at the beginning. But what about? Scripture offers some feminine images for God. It's like, yep, that also is not denied, but you still end up with that fundamental polarity. And if Aslan is the second person of the Trinity in the supposal, which he is, it only makes sense for everything else to follow through as it was before, just now with paws and a tail.
Yeah.
Wonderful. What else can people consume of your material? Where can people go to find out more about you? Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, thanks, David. I try to keep my website, anniecrawford.net, updated with new articles and podcasts and classes that I'm doing. So that's a great place to just go see what I've been up to.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. And viewers, please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.